I'm James Turk. I'm a director of the Gold Money Foundation, and I'm pleased to be here today with Edwin Vieira, the author of Pieces of Eight, which is a book that the Gold Money Foundation just recently republished. Edwin, it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
My pleasure to be with you, James.
Edwin, I can't tell you how many emails I've received saying great things about the book, Pieces of Eight. I want to start by talking a little bit about that. I remember reading the first edition of it back in 1983, perhaps.
That's right.
And it was a great book, and now the new edition, which came out 20 years or so later. What's the background for Pieces of Eight?
Well, basically it derives from the Gold Commission that was held in the early 1980s. And a talk I had with Ron Paul, Congressman, really by accident. It wasn't in relationship to the Gold Commission hearings. And I asked some of the people in his office whether they happened to have a constitutional study of the role of gold and silver in the American monetary system. And they said no. And I said, well, how can you be having Gold Commission hearings looking to the present role when you're not looking back to see what the constitutional principles are? And someone said, well, if you think that's so important, why don't you put something in? So I did. I wrote a 60-page typewritten study called Constitutional Principles of the Monetary System. And it came in at the very end of the Gold Commission hearing, so I didn't have an opportunity to testify, and it's lost somewhere in the bowels of Congress, wherever they keep things of that nature. But then Ron Paul later suggested that that be published. Well, I thought it wasn't sufficient, so I expanded it. It became a 380-something page book, to which Congressman Paul wrote an introduction. And then a number of years went by, and people started asking for it, and it was out of print. And I said, well, I'd collect a lot of other information on this, and let me do a more complete job. So in 2002, I came out with a second revised edition, which was now 1,700 pages long. And just last year and into this year, we've come out with a Gold Money Foundation special edition of it. So it's now available, actually on the internet through Amazon.
Yeah, we've received a lot of requests to have it available outside the U.S., but now it can be ordered through Amazon, and the name of the shipper is Auriga.
Auriga.
Auriga, A-U-R-I-G-A.
That's correct. They're the ones that handle that particular.
So the book will be available, or is available now on Amazon through Auriga.
Absolutely.
And it can also be ordered through the Gold Money Foundation
Through the Gold Money
website
Foundation, that's right. And then actually those orders I tend to fulfill, especially the international ones.
Okay. How did you develop this interest in the monetary aspects of money, the legal side?
Well, before I started studying law, I was a chemist, or at least I was studying chemistry. And in that particular discipline, you have a lot of time because things are cooking in the laboratory, so I spent time in the library. And I simply became interested in economics, read a great deal about economics. And one thing you know when you study economics is that money and banking are central to a free market system, positively or negatively. So when I went to law school, I was also interested in that subject, took courses in law and economics.
And this was at Harvard?
At Harvard,
yeah.
At Harvard. And one of the things I discovered was that they didn't discuss those matters. All of the important monetary decisions, banking decisions of the Supreme Court were simply not treated in any depth. And I began collecting information on that myself, simply because I was interested, essentially putting it away in a box. And then one day I had a client who was interested in bringing a test case on that subject. And now I began putting the material together to see what we could use in that particular case. And that led me by accident into Ron Paul's office, because the client knew some people who were working in that office. And he brought me in to talk to them during the time the Gold Commission hearings were being held. And one thing led to another, and the next thing I knew I was writing Pieces of Eight, the initial volume. And I just continued writing and lecturing and researching in this subject ever since. It's an essentially endless proposition.
How many articles have you written over the years?
Oh,
there must be dozens.
Dozens, yeah.
I've seen you on a number of different websites, News with the View.
News with Views, and of course these things are picked up,
yeah,
and they end up having lives of their own.
And they go viral.
Yeah, especially now, given the problems we're having.
Yeah, let's talk about the problems we're having. What's the constitutional solution for today's monetary problems?
Well, I think the practical constitutional, there's really two levels. There's the ideal constitutional solution, which is we do this through Congress. We spin the Federal Reserve off the government. We no longer make it a kind of official tie between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve.
You mean close it? Or?
Excuse me?
You mean close the Federal Reserve?
Well, I'd let them straighten themselves out. I think you run into the problems of rational economic calculation if you want Congress to come in and say how the banking system should correct its own problems. But you certainly spin it off from the Treasury so you don't have this support that the Treasury gives to the Federal Reserve.
Just to use one of the things that I've learned from you, just like we have separation of church and state.
Separation of bank and state.
Separation of bank and state.
And then the reintroduction of gold and silver as the official currencies. Because, of course, in private transactions, people can choose whatever they want as a non-fraudulent currency. But I don't think that's going to happen because of the political deadlock, actually the brain-dead political deadlock that's going on in Congress. But I think the basic problem in Washington is that there's political deadlock. So you're not going to see the type of reform, separation of bank and state and reintroduction of sound money that I'm proposing coming out of either the Republican or Democratic parties, whether it's Congress or the administration. But the interesting thing in our constitutional system is we have an intermediate level of government that has many important reserved powers that relate directly to at least currency, banking as well, but I'm more interested in having some what I would call scientific currency standard imposed, because if you don't have that, you're still going to have problems in the banking sector. And what I'm talking about there, of course, the state governments. What most people don't realize is that constitutionally the state governments have the authority as governments to institute, to adopt, to use their own alternative currency, and the Constitution specifically points out that no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, which of course if you flip that over to the other side says, well, the states have a reserved power to make gold and silver a tender in payment of debts. And that in fact was determined by the Supreme Court way back after the Civil War. In the late 1800s, that exact question arose. Could the states maintain a gold and silver economy essentially within the state governmental structure, even though Congress had made legal tender treasury notes available?
This was the greenback that was
so-called
circulating
greenbacks.
at the
That's
time.
right. At the time they were non-redeemable. And it came to the Supreme Court 2 occasions, and the Supreme Court ruled on both that the states having this essentially residual governmental sovereignty, because some of their sovereignty, of course, has been transferred to the government in Washington, but having this residual sovereignty, they can choose their own alternative currency. They do not have to follow a directive from Congress. So we have this alternative mechanism for adopting state by state, and then I think it would spread fairly quickly, a sound currency at that level without necessarily having to go for approval, authorization, or whatever to Congress.
So we don't have the political will in Washington to go back to a constitutional money, in your view, and that's one that I share with. And given 50 states, it's logical to assume that there may be half a dozen, maybe 10 states where there are people there who have the political will to go in the right direction by going back to constitutional money. Is that basically
that's
as you
exactly my
see
point.
it?
We have 50 shots there,
Yeah.
50 different legislatures. And my view is that if 1 or 2 states adopts a sound alternative currency, then the full force of the market is going to be behind that reform. Other states are going to look at this and say, wait a minute, we could do the same thing to protect ourselves against a crumbling banking system, against a crumbling currency system. And you'll begin to see it spread like oil on water. And of course, once that happens, once the full force of the market is behind it, then Congress eventually will have to catch up with it.
Yeah. You know, I guess it is spreading, and the original movement was back in New Hampshire, where you were the driving force behind introducing a sound money bill to the New Hampshire legislature. And you know, I was very pleased to play a small part in that role.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Unfortunately, it got locked in committee and never did see the light of day. But what it did do is it showed the way for other states that by adopting that type of legislation, maybe they could have more success in their states than New Hampshire did. Can you just sort of trace the history from, you know, when you started in New Hampshire to where we are?
That's back about 7 years ago, as I recall, in New Hampshire. And that was a problem, what I would call the political neck of the funnel. A particular committee, and some of the people on that committee that did not want that issue to go forward. And they were capable at the time of essentially suppressing it politically within the structure, you know, that parliamentary means. However, the genie got out of the bottle, as it were, through the internet. And that idea was picked up in Indiana, it was picked up in Colorado, it was picked up in Missouri, and a number of other places. In Montana, in fact, first it was submitted to a committee, died in committee. Last session, it went to the floor of the House. I think it lost 46 to 52, pretty close. So I would suspect that the next time in Montana, there will probably be more political force to see that pass in at least one House, because I can't imagine the economy is going to become any better in the next 2 years. I know that a similar bill has been proposed in South Carolina. There was a bill dealing with gold coinage as opposed to electronic currency, which I was favoring in Georgia. Virginia had a bill, didn't get out of committee in the last session, but it's going to be put in this fall in the next session. Texas, they're talking about the same thing. So there are a number of states where there is great interest, and it's gotten to the point, at least in one or two of them, where it's come to a vote in the committee, or in Montana as the example, on the actual House floor. So I think, as I say, the genie is out of the bottle on this. And it's simply a matter of people taking a look around and saying, wait a minute, we have a serious economic problem, can't be solved in Washington. How do we protect ourselves against it? And here's at least an approach. Let me not say an answer, but it's an approach.
So that's the core of the idea, that if there are problems with the dollar, there is an alternative currency available for people for use within that state to transact with one another. Because the history has been that when a currency collapses, the economy is destroyed as well. This way the economy can continue with the alternative currency, which of course would be constitutional-based money.
That's right, and I look at this in a sense as an insurance policy. I mean, I've been driving for years, and I have yet to hit the little blind girl in the wheelchair in the crosswalk. But that doesn't mean that I don't keep $300,000 to $500,000 of personal liability insurance on my car. Same situation here. You set up one of these alternative currency systems of the type I'm proposing, it really is almost costless. No one necessarily has to use it, but it's there in the event that the circumstances are such that it's the only alternative. So it's an insurance policy. We have no insurance policy now in any of the states for a major breakdown of the currency system. And yet we're facing conditions which would suggest to any prudent person that that's certainly a possibility.
Well, is Utah the first state actually that's developed a mechanism to enable this to happen?
Well, Utah is the first one that has passed an actual bill. And their bill recognized United States coinage, gold and silver coinage, as legal tender in Utah, which of course it is pursuant to federal law anyway, but at least it's a recognition by the state, formal recognition. And then secondly, they said, well, no one's going to be required to use it. Although, of course, if you make a contract in gold or silver, you'd be required to pay in gold or silver. That's just the law at the present time. And the third part of that statute was to eliminate, as far as Utah was concerned, taxes on transactions involving exchanges of United States gold and silver coin for Federal Reserve notes or vice versa. So they made a level playing field, essentially, from the tax point of view with respect to alternative currencies. Now, we still have that problem at the federal level, but at least Utah is showing the necessity to deal with that. And I think if alternative currencies are adopted in, let's say, a few states, would probably have to be more
Half a
than
dozen?
one. Half a dozen, let's say. That at that stage, the treasurers in those states are going to go to the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and say, look, we have to make an accommodation here. We have to correct in some way the federal tax approach to this so that our state alternative currencies can go forward. Because if we don't do that, then we, the states, are going to take this issue to the Supreme Court, where we have the ability to bring a case in the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. That means directly in the Supreme Court, which I imagine would be a very high-profile political piece of litigation.
What is the authority that enables the federal government to tax what is constitutional money?
Well, they shouldn't, because this is an exchange. If you assume the Federal Reserve notes are constitutional, we'll leave aside the legal questions with those. Here you have an exchange of one form of United States currency, Federal Reserve notes, for another form of United States currency, the gold eagles or the silver liberties or whatever. And you'd say, well, wait a minute. How can you tax that transaction? And the answer is, well, you shouldn't be able to, because if these things have been called dollars and these things have been called dollars, then legally they're equal. Now, what the taxing people say is, oh no, there's an economic distinction between them. A $50 United States gold coin is obviously worth more economically than a $50 Federal Reserve note. And therefore, we, the taxing authorities, say that we can tax an exchange here where there's a gain. I guess they give people losses too, but primarily where there's a gain. But interestingly enough, this particular question was decided by the Supreme Court, again, right after the Civil War, because you had the legal tender greenbacks, irredeemable in gold, circulating side by side with the gold and silver currency. And there was a case called Thompson versus Butler. Gold clause contract was involved. Butler won, and he had a judgment for more than $5,000 payable in gold. He wanted to prevent that case from being appealed. And at the time, the rule was that if a case was not worth more than $5,000 in issue, then the Supreme Court did not have jurisdiction to hear the appeal. So Butler reduced the value of his own judgment to exactly $5,000. Well, that didn't stop Thompson. He filed his appeal papers anyway. And the Supreme Court threw it out and said, wait a minute, yes, we understand that economically speaking, $5,000 in gold is less, or there's more paper money than for $5,000 in gold. However, Congress has chosen, for whatever reason, to call both of them dollars. And therefore, we can't choose between them. Monetarily, there is no difference. So the principle's already been established, but for some reason, well, I understand what the reason is, for income reasons, right, for revenue reasons. The taxing authorities take this other position. It will be interesting to see, though, if you had a state with an alternative currency, how that would stand up in the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, they would have to go back to the precedent, which is the Thompson versus Butler.
They have to go back to their own precedent. And that precedent simply takes account of the fact that Congress has this authority, and if it calls this a dollar, and if it calls this a dollar, legally, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah. You know, the thing I find interesting is that, let's assume I'm going to go to London for a month, and I need £10,000 for spending for a holiday there. And I buy my £10,000 and I spend $16,000, exchange rate of $1.6 per British pound. And then 3 months later, I go to the UK and start spending the £10,000 that I bought before. But the exchange rate when I'm there is actually 1.8. So I'm actually spending $18,000 of purchasing power at those exchange rates, which I had actually bought before. But because I'm spending the money, there's no taxable event there. So I like to distinguish between, am I holding something for spending or am I holding something for capital gain? So the other point of view would be, if I bought the £10,000 with a view to profiting from and speculating on the exchange rate movement, and I sold those £10,000 and got £18,000 back, maybe one could argue that that's a capital gain or an investment. But the prior example that I used, I'm spending those pounds, there's no appreciation there, or there's no taxable event, in my view.
Well, I would accept the capital gain concept if you're taking United States currency and you're purchasing foreign currency or vice versa, and playing that market, right?
Playing the exchange
Right,
rates.
playing the exchange rates there for the purpose of quote-unquote investment.
Or speculation.
Or speculation. But if you're dealing with United States currency versus United States currency, theoretically, and actually as a matter of law, equal purchasing power is supposed to be the standard among all forms of the United States currency. In fact, the Secretary of the Treasury is required by law to exchange gold certificates with the Federal Reserve in order to maintain the equal purchasing power of all forms of the United States currency. That's an exact quote.
Yeah.
All right? And you know what the standard is for that exchange? 42 2/9 per ounce of
Oh,
gold.
yeah, 42
42.2222, right, the irrational number. 42 2/9. All right? So obviously the Secretary of the Treasury is not doing his job there, or the Federal Reserve is not doing its job, or the two of them not doing their job together. Right? So if there is a speculative aspect to different forms of the United States currency, we have to trace it back to the Treasury. It's the Treasury's problem. So here we have a situation where the Treasury is coming to people and saying, look, we're going to tax you on an appreciation that is caused by the failure of the Secretary of the Treasury to perform his duty. I find that rather ironic.
Yeah, it is terribly ironic. Does that authority to the Secretary of Treasury come from the regulate the value thereof clause of Article 1, Section 10?
Well, ultimately, regulate the value thereof of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 of Congress's power. And you can trace it back to the 1933, 1934 legislation under Roosevelt.
Which was, that was the...
Well, first they had the gold seizure, and then they removed the gold clause contracts, and then they had the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. And that's the tie-in. All the gold was seized, put in the national gold stockpile, and then they issued gold certificates to the Federal Reserve, so there's a gold certificate account the Federal Reserve has. And supposedly the Secretary of the Treasury is to maintain this balance by buying and selling gold, because the Federal Reserve can also buy and sell gold. And there's his statutory requirement. And for a long time it was $35, went up to $35 under Roosevelt. It was $35 until 1971, and then you had the series of acts that eventually brought it up to 42 2/9, where it's sat since sometime in the 1970s. But during that whole period of time, certainly up to when it was $35 an ounce, well, you had no problem because there was this redemption going on. But when they stopped in 71, the redemption, now something else had to be done to maintain whatever that equilibrium figure was. And quite obviously, it hasn't been done, because what's the price of an ounce of gold in the marketplace today? 1,500 and something? And that's bullion, not even coinage.
Right. coinage would have a slight premium
Yeah,
because of
slight
the
premium,
fabrication
that's
costs
right.
and everything involved
Right.
in it. No one has called the Secretary of the Treasury on the carpet,
No.
though, for decades. Why not?
No. Well, I don't know. Maybe they thought this is one of those losing arguments. But I bring the issue back to the states. You have half a dozen of the states set up an alternative currency, and the Treasury then says, well, we're not going to recognize, we're going to continue to tax this or whatever. They're going to give them some kind of trouble. And the states say, well, fine, you don't want to negotiate this. We're going to take this to the Supreme Court of the United States, original jurisdiction, which means we get in right away. Supreme Court becomes the trial court. And we're going to raise this issue, among others. And let's see where that goes when the public is now finally recognizing that you have a collapsing currency. Which way is the Supreme Court going to go when the states are saying, well, this is the alternative going to save us economically, and the Treasury is saying no on the basis of essentially rogue action because they're not following their own statutes?
Yeah. Is this actually a way to develop competing currencies without actually having a specific piece of legislation allowing currencies to compete with one another?
Well, that's actually my hope. What will happen, that the state sets up an alternative currency for its own use, its own citizens' use. And it's an alternative currency. I'm not proposing that the states say that Federal Reserve notes can no longer be used or that private transactions couldn't be made in euros or whatever. This is an alternative currency, and the state, to some degree, at least initially, will start using it for its own purposes. And then, once it's available to people, competition sets in, because now they'll actually have a choice. And if they're watching a crumbling Federal Reserve system and a highly depreciating paper currency, here's the option. It's an insurance policy, in essence.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's really an insurance policy in that sense, in the sense of my hitting the little blind girl in the wheelchair, because I think this is going to happen. Right? This is essentially a sure bet. But our problem now is we have no such alternative. And as you said earlier, if there's a major currency collapse, then there will be social dislocations, economic dislocations, political radicalism. I mean, everything comes out of Pandora's box at that stage. And we have to be prepared for that.
Yeah. And the scary thing is that when there is a monetary collapse, you can go either the right way, like America did after the collapse of the Continental, or you can go the wrong way, which is perhaps what Germany did after the collapse of the Reichsmark in the 1920s with increasing fascism.
Well, I don't know you, James, but the only example that I know of where you had a collapsing currency, political instability, and so forth that led to what we would consider to be sound government was the American experience.
Yeah, that's the only one
I
I'm
think
aware
the only
of as
one,
well.
I think, in history.
Yeah. Whether we do it again the
Yeah.
second time when the dollar collapses or not. only
Well, pretty
time
tough
will tell.
odds. I mean, if you don't have, what are the odds on it happening twice? But that one, of course, was done at what we could call the national level, because of course they had the Continental Congress and they had the Constitutional Convention. And they gave us this mechanism through the federal structure, which includes the intermediate layer of the states. So actually we may be better off in terms of institutional structures than they were, because it's already there. I mean, it's in the Constitution, the state governments are there, and I think the state governments have quite a bit more political credibility than the government in Washington. And as we mentioned before, well, there were 50 of them. So if some of them want to maintain the ostrich position, well, that's fine, but we can expect that some of the others will be a little more foresighted, a little more prudent. And I think once that happens, and you actually have the ability to have competing currencies, because now the state's a pretty big institution economically, most of them. They play a fairly large financial role in their economies. Once that's there, I think the average person knows his own interests if he has the institutional ability to take that action.
Does this also have potential implications for restructuring the political system, putting it back more like the framers of the Constitution intended, that a true federalist system rather than a consolidated power in Washington, ruling the country, have a more confederate type of system where the different states reserve to themselves, use those powers that have been reserved to themselves rather than relying on Washington?
Well, I think this might very well be the beginning of that, because once they recognize that they can take this kind of action, really that they're duty bound to take this kind of action to protect their own citizens, but once they recognize that they can do that and they are not really dependent upon Washington, then there will be other areas of reserve powers into which they'll move. I think that's just natural. Right now, the problem I've seen, practically speaking, is so many state legislators assume that currency reform, alternative currency, or competing currencies, whatever we want to call it, is not something within the ken of the state government.
They're just not informed.
Right, it's something reserved. The Federal Reserve is supposed to handle this. U.S. Treasury is supposed to handle this. We in the state aren't supposed to handle this. First thing is to point out that, well, here's the Constitution. No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin, tender, and debts. Here are these Supreme Court decisions. Here's the ability for you to do it within the context of your legal authority. Here's your legal duty to do something like this, because ultimately you have what's called the police power, which is designed to protect the health, safety, and welfare, economic as well as medical or what have you, of the population. So you have the duty, you have the constitutional authority, there's a practical way for you to do it, and if you wait, you're not going to get the kind of action you expect out of Washington. In fact, it's probably going to be more of the same or worse. So this problem's not going away. And you people at the state legislature, you have the responsibility. And the question I ask them, Virginia, for instance, I was talking to some Virginia legislators a while ago, I said, if the Federal Reserve System collapses, we go into some kind of hyperinflationary event where the currency becomes next to worthless, what will the Commonwealth of Virginia, as far as its government, and what will the citizens of Virginia use as their currency? And then you see the little light bulb go on in their head because they realize, well, there isn't anything else. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen? Oh. And then the next step is, well, it's up to you, right? You're in the legislature. You've taken this responsibility politically. You're holding yourself out to the public as having the competence. Now let's see the prudence.
And given the backdrop of continuing financial problems, not just in the United States but globally, it's giving people the understanding that they need to act, to have that backup safety net just in case.
Mm-hmm. I think so. And when we talk about competing currencies, as I like to say, any little girl in Bangladesh that walks by an internet cafe and looks in the window can see people all over the world talking about competition in currencies, alternatives to the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve no longer the world reserve currency, whatever. They have all sorts of different ideas, but they're all in synchronization on that particular fact. Something has to be done. Russia, China, South Africa, run down the list of these countries, Brazil, right? Why aren't we thinking about it here domestically? Mm-hmm. This is, as it were, the eye of the storm. This is the focal point. This is our Federal Reserve System.
Well, what's happening internationally, in my view, is people are thinking about it and they're seeing gold reemerging as a form of currency.
That's right.
That's their protection against, what they see as the potential or probable collapse of the dollar at some point in time if the U.S. government doesn't get off of this road of more debt and more deficits and put some discipline on spending. So if people are seeing that internationally, isn't it sort of logical that the state governments should also be seeing gold and silver as the natural alternative?
Well, that's the point I make to them, especially given that there's the Constitution. And what does the Constitution say with respect to their reserve power?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, I know you've written an awful lot about the constitutional authorities for state militias. What is the link between militias and sound money, constitutional sound money and constitutional militias?
Well, the purpose ultimately of the constitutional militia is to maintain every form of what we call today homeland security within each state. And then the militia have certain duties to the national government if they're called forth by Congress. Leave that aside. But certainly within each state. And one aspect of homeland security has to be economic security. If you don't have a sound economy, forget everything else, right? You're down the drain. What we don't have in any state today is a militia structured the way the Constitution really requires. So I have been promoting that revitalization across the board because there are a number of things that need to be done. But one of them, of course, is economic security. And the reason I promote the militia for that is if we had a constitutional militia, every member of it could be required to have one of these alternative currency accounts as part of his militia homeland security duty.
Preparation,
just in
case.
Right? He wouldn't necessarily have to use it if he didn't want to use it, but he'd have to have it. And secondly, of course, you have the businessmen. They're all members of the militia too, and they would be required after some number of days, after the system was up and running, to post alternative prices for their goods and services in the alternative currency. Once again, they and their customers would not necessarily have to use it, although I suspect they would start using it pretty soon, but there it would be. And my estimate is that if you pass one of these statutes within 60 to 90 days, you could have all of this set up. The institutional structure would be there. If people wanted to use it, fine. If they didn't, that's fine too. But I expect that the circumstances would be such that they'd start using it pretty quickly. And then if you have competition between sound currency and a rotting vegetable currency, if you will, well, Gresham's law is going to work in reverse, right?
Yeah, the good money will drive
Good money will drive the bad money out of circulation, and then this will put pressure, because I don't want to abolish the Federal Reserve, I think that's a much too complicated problem, but it will put pressure on the banking system and on Congress to restructure their act. Because now the states And the population of the states, and what's that? That's the total population of the country ultimately, right? Other than the District of Columbia. They can walk away from the Federal Reserve System.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to be tremendous pressure on that system and on Congress to straighten up their act.
Well, let's go back, because I think this ties into the point we were talking about earlier, separation of church and state, separation of bank and state.
Mm-hmm.
Is this how you see separation of bank and state evolving?
Well, I certainly see separation of currency and bank, if you will, right? We're going to have an official currency of gold and silver. We're not going to be using this debt currency coming out of some kind of banking
Because after all, Congress has the power to coin, they don't have the power to print.
Right?
according
They
to
certainly don't have the power to
Constitution.
delegate some kind of power to a banking cartel made up of private
Yeah,
interests.
if they don't have the power themselves, they can't
No,
delegate.
they can't delegate. That's obvious. All right. Well, we can't control them, so we'll put the reform in at the state level. I think that what you would then see developing in the states is a different type of banking system, one that uses the alternative currency, probably one that will generate bankers' acceptances so you can have that short-term credit that's necessary to maintain the economy.
Banking in the traditional sense.
Yeah, banking in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
And with a scientifically based monetary standard,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because an ounce of gold is an ounce of gold is an ounce of gold wherever you are
Right.
in the world, right?
Which is essentially very important, because that provides the means of communication, economic calculation, which is the basis of society when we go into the
Exactly.
marketplace to fulfill our needs and wants.
And I don't see how you can have a structure of rational economic calculation with a non-rational monetary unit,
Which is what we have.
which
at
is
the
what we
moment.
have now.
Yeah.
We have a debt-based political money, which by hypothesis is non-rational because it's driven by all sorts of political interests that have no eventual tie-in back to the marketplace. There's no actual link, unbreakable link. Whereas gold and silver, there's the unit, there's the market tie, there's the element of rationality as far as we can get it within a market system.
So this actually, addresses the point that I think a lot of people in the country intuitively understand, that the monetary system as it exists today serves the interest of, certain powers, but doesn't serve the broad, sweep of the nation, and surely not the middle class, who really don't understand necessarily what's going on in terms of the debasement of the currency.
I think that's correct. I think our major problem over the years has been the loss of what I would call the aperceptive historical mass of knowledge about money and banking, and then the willingness of people, almost robotic, to accept ideas, directives, propaganda coming out of Washington. But of course now the screw is being turned economically, and there's that old saying attributed, I think, to Samuel Johnson. Nothing focuses a man's mind more than his impending hanging. Right? So as the economic screws continue to tighten down on people, they're going to be looking around for answers. They're certainly not getting those answers out of Washington.
So it's not too surprising we see a Tea Party movement as a consequence?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to become one of the issues that breaks up this two-party oligopoly, the currency issue. That eventually we're going to get back to you remember the turn of the 20th century, 1890s into 1900 and then all the way to 1913. Money and banking were on the front pages of newspapers. They were being discussed in union halls by your blue-collar workers, right? Mm-hmm. This was not something that was arcane, that the average person didn't know about, the average person didn't want to get involved in. We've lost all of that political involvement, and as a result, power has gravitated into the hands of a few people and left the middle class, essentially at the mercy of this system.
Yeah.
We're hostages to the system.
I'm sort of optimistic on this point, though, because you're absolutely right. The 20th century is marked by, I think, the general decline in terms of people's understanding of what money is, its importance to society. But the internet, I think, is sort of changing that now. Would you agree that the information available on the internet is...
I think the internet has broken the logjam on that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have things like gold money that are coming out. I mean, that kind of technology has been proven. There it is. It works.
Yeah.
Right? It's at the cutting edge. We can solve problems very quickly with that kind of technology because it can be picked up essentially off the shelf. Right. And used by a state government. So as people realize that this is doable, it's not simply some pie-in-the-sky ivory tower type theorizing about why the Federal Reserve is not an effective instrument. We know that, there are problems with that, but you eventually come back to the question, or very quickly come back to the question, well, what can we actually do to correct this? Mm-hmm. And now we have it. And the more people that realize that it's doable, the more likely it is that it's going to be done.
And the more likely they're going to understand not only is it doable, but it's really essential to go back to a country which the framers originally envisioned and put into place for it,
right.
For us.
Right, and that's my ultimate goal. First things first, people tend to look at this problem in short-term economic approach. Well, what's in it for me? We say, well, what's in it for you is financial protection against this tidal wave that's coming in. Next step, state governments begin to reassert their authority. Next step, we actually make the federal system work. And less power, or power is drained from Washington, and it comes back to the states and to the people. And it can be done first through currency, simply because we have the context now to do it there.
In your assessment, you know, we're moving pretty rapidly in terms of the problems with the dollar, the growth of the debt, you know, the federal deficits. We've got national debt issues coming up. They're trying to increase, you know, $2 trillion to carry it through to the November 2012 election, which in my view is just kicking the can down the road and showing that there's no political will to solve that problem. On the other hand, you've got states starting to address the issue and recognizing that there's a train wreck coming, and you know, maybe they should do something just in case that train wreck does really hit. Which is going to come first? Is the currency going to collapse and we're going to have that train wreck, or do you think that people will be able to prudently act at the state level and come up with solutions and maybe even head off that train wreck?
Well, I think some states are going to come up with this solution sooner rather than later. I think it's a hope, because I can't be a prognosticator, I'm not Nostradamus, right, before the train actually hits the end of the track. Whether that will be enough, I don't know, except that having that much created will enable others in the context of the crisis to attempt to shift over. I mean, you have to have the example. Somebody has to lead. And that's our difficulty. We're on the Titanic without lifeboats at the present time, right? Mm-hmm. We've got a dysfunctional crew, we've hit the iceberg, help is not coming, and we have no lifeboats. So we're in a worse position, I guess, than the folks on the Titanic were. Except, for us, we can create those lifeboats now before this ship goes down. Mm-hmm. And if we have a few of them, well, that's better than nothing. But I have a feeling that, because, I mean, no, James, you agree with me on this. I mean, the market is a tremendous force when we let it act to its full potential. And in this context, provide the alternative currency, and the full force of the free market is going to be behind that. And then it will just sweep politics along with it.
Yeah, that's how I've always seen it. And you know, I've always felt that the answer to this problem, like answers to all problems, are going to come from the market. They're not going to come from government. Mm-hmm. And that the more alternatives that the market provides will help get us through what look like it's going to be a very difficult time, you know, given what's happening to the dollar. Unless there's political will and political wisdom in Washington to get off of this path that they're on, what I call the path to the fiat currency graveyard, you know, do a 180-degree about turn and go back to constitutional sound money. And while there's a lot of attention being given, to, for example, to people like Ron Paul and perhaps a few others, they're still in the minority and unlikely to be able to turn that ship of state around and put it in the right direction.
No, I think that's right. I think at the national level in Washington, the likelihood is probably a negative number, at least in terms of this train wreck agenda that we're talking about. Yeah. But at the state level, we have the opportunity, and the reason I focus on the states is because I suppose theoretically what I'm talking about could be done by individuals. You could have competing currencies started by individuals or businesses, but the transaction costs are too high. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have enough political visibility. And there are certain things that might be done by rogue agents in the Treasury Department or even rogue agents in some state agencies to kind of suppress that activity. Whereas if you bring a state government in at this stage, then you tie the political and the market forces together, as long as it's done on a sound basis, sound currency basis.
Right. This video is going to be seen all over the world, all over the states. Is there any additional comments that you would like to leave with people, as you see things unfolding here, or what perhaps they can do to protect themselves or to start a sound money movement in their particular state? Is there any guidance that you?
Well, I think that's exactly the point. Starting a sound money movement in your particular state, or for that matter, your particular country, right, yeah. Wherever. There's a lot of information out on the internet about these alternative currency bills that have been put up. One of the things that I am promoting now is for people to go to their state representatives and say, set up an investigatory commission. There's a good bill that was written in Virginia on that, so that we can bring some witnesses in front of an official body, get a record, get the evidence, get the testimony, educate some other state legislators, and propose some legislation that investigatory commission would take back to the legislature and say, this is what we need enacted.
You know, in other words, first air the problem and start addressing it, bring in different people, different points of view. And I guess it's really a recognition that there's a problem that exists, and secondly, that there's no solution at the moment, you know, if this problem does become worse.
And I think proposing the solution to them is not simply we have a problem and we have no solution. Here is a solution. Do you have anything better? And the answer will be, well, no, we don't. Therefore, all right, therefore, this will be picked up somewhere. At some stage, someone is going to pick up on this. And that's the beginning of the end for our problem.
It seems so simple. All somebody has to really do is pick up the Constitution and understand what the original intent of the framers was, understand what they went through with the Continental and the collapse of the Continental, why they tried to create a common market with a common currency. And then I would probably also recommend reading the Coinage Act of 1792, which basically puts into practice, you know, what the intent was of the framers in the Constitution.
It's amazing how simple it is. Of course, they were rather remarkable people, put an assembly of that type together. But I don't think it's beyond our ability to look back and say, well, of course they did it this way. How else would you want to structure this kind of a system rationally? To limit government control, to maximize individual freedom, to take full advantage of the marketplace. This is exactly what you'd put in. Our advantage now is because they were using coinage, right? They used a bimetallic system. Why? Because they didn't have the information available to be able to change the gold-silver ratio on a minute-to-minute basis.
But it gave Congress the power to regulate the
But it
value
gave Congress
of,
the power to regulate so
change
they
that
could do it.
gold-silver ratio so you could be on a silver standard or a gold standard.
We now have the technological ability to make that system work perfectly.
Yeah, and that's the key advantage that we have.
That we have now. And how foolish we would be if we didn't take advantage of that.
But I will say that, you know, as brilliant as the framers were, the Continental did collapse. You know, the political will just wasn't there to get off of this path to the hyperinflation currency graveyard. The Continental collapsed, and only then did they have the will to get together and create the Constitution and a new system.
But you know what's amazing about that? Who were the people that issued the Continental?
The Continental Congress.
Yeah, and the Continental Congress were made up of many of the same people who went to the Constitutional Convention, or they came from the various state legislatures that had their own legal tender laws and their own paper money. And they took a look at what they themselves had done and said, no more. Yeah. This was a terrible mistake.
Well, that's clear from the debates
and
the notes, Madison's notes to the...
And so there's one of the examples of, I think, as far as I'm concerned, the only example I know of, where people who had made that kind of a political mistake did not try to save face and maintain the system and, you know, improve the system. They turned around and said, this was wrong. We're going to correct this for all time by putting in constitutional limitations to prevent it in the future.
And so it was for 180 years until we abandoned the wisdom in 1971. And we're now seeing with
30s, really.
Well, 30s really, yeah, okay.
That was the beginning of it.
Yeah, that was the beginning of it. The last remnants of the gold standard or silver standard were ended in 1971. And I guess the tragedy is that, you know, here we are with the dollar, not unlike where the Continental was near its final collapse. And basically we didn't learn from history. We didn't read the Constitution. We didn't understand the wisdom of the framers, and we're going to have to relearn once again, you know, the things that they went through.
Well, I refuse to accept that adage that no one ever learns anything from history except that no one ever learns anything from history. Right. Some of us have learned something from history, and I think the circumstances are such that we can sell those ideas.
Yes, and help educate.
Educate, and at least on a scale sufficient to begin a movement in the right direction.
Yeah, well, you know, that's the whole purpose of the Gold Money Foundation. It's, you know, a not-for-profit organization that we founded basically to provide educational material. And with regard to the monetary situation in the United States, there's no better reference work than Pieces of Eight. Edwin, it's been a real pleasure to chat with you. I really appreciate you taking the time out, and best of luck to you in the future.
Thank you, James. It's been my pleasure.